Let's pray. Oh God, thank you for your word, and we thank you for this part of it, and we pray that as we focus our attention on it, that you would open our eyes, O Lord, to see your glory that is here, and that in seeing your glory that is here, we would love what we see and respond with our whole selves. Might we believe what's here, Lord? Might we cherish this, and might we respond with a like faith of our own. Father, would you use this morning's passage to create and to strengthen Jonathans among us here. For the sake of your name, I pray. Amen. Please have a seat. Today's passage really picks up midstream from where we were last week, and we want to just establish something really important that we didn't touch on too clearly last week. Saul disobeyed the Lord, made an offering that he wasn't supposed to make, and was told that his kingdom was not going to continue as a result. Now, that does not mean, this is really important as we put together the book of 1 Samuel, that does not mean that Saul has officially been rejected as king. That hasn't happened, ... yet, if you know what's coming. Rather, what Samuel's words last week point to is the fact that Saul is not going to have a dynasty. In other words, where Saul's sons are going to reign after him, and his grandsons and great-grandsons in succession, and the whole thing is going to be named after him, the house of Saul. There's not going to be a house of Saul. That's not going to happen. A replacement king is already waiting in the wings for whenever Saul is finished. So that's what was established last week. And what that means is that Jonathan, who we were introduced to last week, is not going to be king after his father. And that almost seems unfair, because as we're going to see this week and next, and already started to see last week, Jonathan looks like he'd make a pretty good king. Jonathan is everything that his father is not. Now, if you know where this is going, this series, we're going to wrap up this series in early June with David's anointing, and then we're going to move on to a summer series in the Minor Prophets, and we're going to come back to 1 Samuel probably in a couple of years or so, as this is kind of our pattern as we preach through the whole Bible in sections like this. But I hope that many of us know who's coming. We know that David's coming. And seeing all this material with with Saul and Jonathan really sets up the drama of David. Because here's the thing. One of the best places where Jonathan's character shines through is the way that he responds to the giant killer stealing the spotlight from him. Jonathan was Israel's savior, who had rescued Israel and had fought with the Philistines. And David steals the spotlight, and Jonathan is okay. Not just okay with it, he loves David as he loves his own soul. So if you're bothered that Jonathan doesn't get to be king, just remember that Jonathan wasn't bothered, and this will be probably one of the major points of a future sermon as we look at Jonathan loving David and just celebrate Christian humility. We got nothing to prove. We've got no personal agendas to advance. We just want to serve the Lord. And if he uses us or if he uses someone else, big deal. That's what's coming. We're getting ahead of ourselves, though, because today we want to pick up where we left off. Saul and Jonathan are the only two guys with swords. 80% of their army has abandoned them. People are hiding in caves and holes in the ground. And 3 Philistine raiding bands are moving in 3 directions throughout the land, totally unopposed. Things are really bad. And verse 1 tells us the moment when things start to change. One day, Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come, let us go over to the Philistine garrison on the other side." But he did not tell his father. This is huge. What this shows us is that Saul has lost the confidence of his house, of his family. Jonathan doesn't trust his dad. Jonathan knows that nothing is going to happen if he doesn't do something. So just like before, last week, chapter 13, he went and struck down the Philistine governor or garrison. Once again, Jonathan takes it on himself to go throw down and make something happen. And at his side is his trusty armor bearer, who's also one of the heroes of this chapter, a young man who probably would have carried his shield for him in battle and tended his weapons and fought beside him as a close partner and has no name. Another great side lesson about humility there. But before the story goes any further, it stops to give us a bit of a sense of the setting of what's going on. So this story is just told so well. We get this statement in verse 1, and then we stop and we get the setting before it picks up again. Verse 2 starts to tell us about the setting involving the people. Saul was staying in the outskirts of Gibeah in the pomegranate cave at Migron. Those who were with him were about 600 men. So the word here has to do for pomegranate cave. It's literally under the pomegranate. So it could be a cave, it could be a pomegranate tree. And what's interesting also is the word for staying. Saul was staying in the outskirts of Gibeah. The Hebrew word there can just as well mean sitting. Sitting under a tree is something we see kings and officials doing. But here's what's clear, is that Saul is stationary. Whether it's a cave, whether it's a tree, whether he's staying there or sitting there, he's not doing what? Fighting with the Philistines. And this is important. And then we're told about how he's got 600 people with him, which is not a lot compared to who he had. And then one of those 600 people is singled out, verse 3, including Ahijah, son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, son of Phinehas, son of Eli. 3 reasons why this is important. 3 reasons why this guy gets singled out. First, you remember Eli? We've been in this series for a few weeks now, a few months now. Eli was the priest under whom Samuel apprenticed. Remember the message that Samuel gave to Eli? That you're done, you and your family, your line is done. There's a whole new line of faithful priests that's coming. And now one of the descendants of Eli is here serving as Saul's priest. So either Saul didn't get the memo or he's ignoring the memo. But either way, what we're supposed to see here is a pretty sad pair. We've got a king and a priest, both from failed houses, each of them due for replacement at any point. It's like 2 jugs of milk in the fridge that their due best before date was weeks past. These 2 guys sitting together. And then second, we got to ask, why is there a priest there wearing the ephod? The ephod was like their duty vest that the priests wore when they were on religious duty. It sounds like what Saul has done is what Israel did when they were fighting the Philistines before, which is kind of drag the priests to the front lines as if God were some kind of a good luck charm. Now, that's something we talked about a few weeks ago, and it looks like the same thing is happening again. And there's a third thing that's interesting, and we can miss it a little bit in English. But the phrase here for Ahijah wearing an ephod in verse 3 uses the same construction as Jonathan's armor bearer bearing his armor. So here's why that's important. Because one of the things that this passage is doing is it's setting up a contrast between Saul and Jonathan. And Saul and Jonathan each have a sidekick. Jonathan's sidekick bears his armor. Saul's sidekick bears an ephod. Jonathan is ready to trust God and take action with his armor bearer. Saul is ready to sit around and play religious games with his ephod bearer. So that's part of the contrast that just the Hebrew words here are wanting us to see. And verse 3 finishes up by reminding us that nobody knew that Jonathan had left. Nobody knew that Jonathan had left. Jonathan kept his exit a secret, and that becomes key to the story, especially as it goes on. Okay, so that's the setting of the people. Now, what comes next in verse 4 is the setting of the land, or the geography. And this is really important for how the story works. As we were reading it out loud together, you might have been thinking, blah, 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 Bible details. Okay, so there are no just blah, blah, blah details in the Bible. If the details are there, they're there on purpose, but it sometimes takes some digging to get what's going on, and that's part of what's going on here. So we go back to chapter 13, verse 16. We know that Saul and Jonathan, his son, and the people who were present with them stayed in Geba of Benjamin, but the Philistines encamped at Michmash. Okay, so Geba and Michmash are two towns that are still populated today, and they have names that haven't actually changed much. Jeba and Mukmas, and you can go look these up on Google Maps, like I did this week. Actually, I used Apple Maps, but that's okay. And in between these two towns is a deep ravine or a gorge called the Wadi Suanit. A wadi is a gorge or a ravine that fills up with water in the wet season and then is just dry in the dry season. And this wadi which is basically a canyon, a small canyon, has very steep cliffs on each side. It's a few hundred meters across, and it's about 150 to 250 meters deep, so 500 to 800 feet deep. And so this is a small canyon. Some sections of the walls are almost vertical. You're actually looking at a picture of it on the screen and behind you, as some of you have probably guessed. That's why I changed the graphic here, because we have to visualize this. We have to be able to see this. And here's what's super interesting, and I read this and then went and verified it, like with satellite imagery, is that on the north side of the gorge, closest to Michmash, the cliffs are more bright limestone, and they tend to be steeper. And on the south side, closest to Geba, the slope is a little bit gentler, and the rock there is covered with more scrubby plant growth. And so this is very interesting because we read in verse 4, within the passes, or the gorge, this word can mean that, by which Jonathan sought to go over to the Philistine garrison, there was a rocky crag or a cliff on one side and a rocky crag on the other side. The name of the one was Bozez, which means gleaming or shiny. And the name of the other was Senna, which means thorny. The one crag rose on the north in front of Michmash, the other on the south in front of Geba. Now, all of the detail here is really important for a couple of reasons. The way that this story unfolds, what happens here, is tightly connected to the geography and the layout of this specific canyon. The way that Jonathan is able to slip away undetected, move unseen across the valley, needs to scramble up the other side on his hands and feet. All of this is deeply connected to the landscape here. Even the comments about Israel hiding in caves, this wadi and the cliffs there are full of caves. We just know this. So the geography here is crucial for understanding how the story unfolds, and that's, again, why I wanted you to be able to visualize it. But more than that, this detail adds to what one source called the tactical realism of this passage and the way that it's written, the ring of truth in this passage. So as we're reading this, I hope you're seeing this is a far cry from a long time ago in a land far, far away, lived a noble king. Like, this ain't myth, folks. I hope you're seeing that. This is history written by people who were there. The names of these cliffs correspond to the way that they look, and you can go see it for yourself on Google Maps. This is history written by people who were there, who knew how the land works, and the detail here gives this story just really rich authenticity. So, that's the setting, people and the land. Now we move on to the plan. We pick up once again with Jonathan and his courageous, valiant armor-bearer. Verse 6. Jonathan said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few." This is a key bit of dialogue here in the passage, and it shows us a lot about Jonathan and how he thinks, how he works. Notice what he calls the Philistines. He calls them these uncircumcised. Now, he's not being rude. He's not mocking them. He's not even necessarily pointing out their ethnicity. This isn't a racial slur. Circumcision was the sign of the covenant that God made with Abraham. God made a covenant with Abraham, and the sign for him and his sons for all generations was to be circumcised. And one of the main promises in that covenant was that God gave this land to Abraham and his descendants. So what is Jonathan saying when he points out that those guys over there occupying that opposite cliff on the valley are uncircumcised? What he's saying is, those guys have no right to be here. They're trespassers. This is not their land. God gave it to us, not to them. And can't help but think about present disputes about the land and the way that we can't think about those apart from Galatians chapter 3, which identifies Jesus as the offspring of Abraham. If you want to ask me what I mean by that, please come do that. But at this time, the land belonged to the physical descendants of Abraham, and those guys are not them, so they shouldn't be here. Jonathan knows that God promised to help his people, to fight for his people when it came to their enemies. He knows that them being small in number is no big deal to God. One of the covenant promises given to the children of Abraham in Leviticus 26 said, 5 of you shall chase 100, and 100 of you shall chase 10,000, and your enemies shall fall before you by the sword. So I don't know if Jonathan had that memorized, if he knew these writings better than his dad did. I don't know if Jonathan just knew the stories of what God had done with Gideon and the judges and what was more recent history for them. But it's not hard to imagine Jonathan looking down at his sword and saying, well, I've got a sword. Here's a couple of us. What's stopping God from using us? That's what's going on here. Nothing can stop the Lord from saving by many or by few. Don't miss that Jonathan is not presuming on anything. He says, it may be that the Lord will work for us. It might happen. So he's not saying, I have absolute certainty that this is going to happen. He just knows God can work through us, and that can is enough for him. So here's what's so key about what's happening here. Jonathan is putting himself in a spot, not where he's demanding that God work through him, but where he is just available should God choose to work through him. Hey, if 5 can chase 100, then some people got to do some chasing. Why not me? That's kind of what's going on here. Jonathan is taking a risk. A faith-filled risk. It may be that the Lord will work. I mean, God's probably not going to do anything if we just sit around. He may work through us. It's a little bit like the risk that Joab, David's commander, is going to take some years in the future. Be of good courage, and let us be courageous for our people and for the cities of our God, and may the Lord do what seems good to him. 2 Samuel 10:12. Or a little bit like the risk that Esther takes years later. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Risky faith. Zero chance of success if God does not come through. But if God does come through, this could really do something. Faith is key to this passage. But here's what's also important. This is where the geography comes in. Faith is not the only thing that Jonathan has. Jonathan's actions here also show a certain amount of tactical planning and tactical awareness. So think of the layout here. We've got 2 enemies on opposite sides with a canyon in between them. So what that means is that it's very easy for them to see each other, but it's very hard for them to get to each other. You can imagine if Jonathan was to rally his troops and make a full-out assault on the Philistines would see the whole thing in real time. They'd be able to see them move, see them going down the hill. They would be ready for them as they came up this steep cliff. And you don't make a assault up a hill against a prepared enemy. That's suicide. And that's why we've got this standstill here. That's why the Philistines, very likely, haven't attacked the Israelites, because they're small, but they too are on top of a cliff. They too have an advantage on their side of the canyon. So Jonathan can't do this with a large force. That's guaranteed to fail. He goes with his armor bearer because 2 men can sneak off undetected, move through the canyon without anybody seeing them, and then pop up at a critical moment. Before we keep going, don't miss the wonderful response of his armor bearer. You might not be a Jonathan, but maybe you're an armor bearer who has a friend or someone close to you of great faith. His armor bearer said to him, "Do all that is in your heart. Do as you wish. Behold, I am with you, heart and soul." I'm in, man. Let's roll. That's modern translation. And then Jonathan shares the rest of his plan. Jonathan said, "Behold, we will cross over to the men, and we will show ourselves to them. At some point, they're going to see us. If they say to us," this is verse 9, "Wait until we come to you, then we will stand still in our place, and we will not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' then we will go up, for the Lord has given them into our hand, and this shall be the sign to us." Now, when I first read this passage, I thought Jonathan was doing something kind of like Gideon with his fleece. You know, if it's wet or if it's dry. That's actually not what's happening here. Jonathan knows that at some point, the Philistines are going to see them coming up. And the response of the Philistines at that moment will tell Jonathan how attackable they are. Because if the Philistines say, "Stop there, we're going to come down to you," that means that the Philistines are in a defensive posture. They're watching out for an attack. They don't want to let any hostiles get close to their front lines. They're braced for trouble. And that's not a very safe position to attack from a tactical standpoint. So what's Jonathan going to do in that situation? Well, hence the risk, right? He's going to stand still and apparently trust God with what's next. But if the Philistines say, "Come up to us," what does that show? Well, that shows that they're not worried. That shows that they're off their guard, literally. They're happy to invite 2 soldiers up to their position, their forward position, because they're not expecting an attack. Nobody in their right mind would make an uphill attack against a prepared enemy, especially just 2 soldiers. And this is Jonathan's whole play. He will strike only if he knows that the Philistines are not expecting a strike. This is where we see Jonathan's military background and his tactical wisdom. So there's risk here. He can't control how the Philistines are going to respond. And by the time they see him, he's engaged. And if they say, "Wait there," and they send a force down, he might be dead. But it's a risk that he's willing to take, because if the Lord works for him, then this could go a very different direction. So that's his plan. You see how the plan's connected to the geography. It involves faith. It involves thought. And now he puts his plan into action. Verse 11. Excuse me. So both of them showed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines. And the Philistines said, "Look, Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they've hidden themselves." Remember, there's caves all over here, but this sounds a little bit like they might be comparing them to, rats or cockroaches coming out of their holes. It's pretty rude. And the men of the garrison hailed Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, "Come up to us, and we'll show you a thing. We'll teach you a lesson." This is exactly what Jonathan's looking for. These guys are overconfident. They have no idea what's coming for them. So, continuing in verse 12, Jonathan said to his armor bearer, "Come up after me, for the Lord has given them into the hand of," what's he say? The hand of Israel. Jonathan's not doing this for himself, for his own glory, his own benefit. He's just an agent of the nation. He fights for the nation. Verse 13, then Jonathan climbed up on his hands and feet, which is exactly what you would have to do in this terrain, and his armor bearer after him, and they fell before Jonathan. And his armor bearer killed them after him. This scene would just look so great in a film. You just see these guys show up cresting the ridge, and their visitors are kind of just standing around cocky, but the visitors are not there for a chit-chat. Swords flash. Caught completely off guard, the Philistines fall before Jonathan and his armor-bearer. Blood is spilt, and in that first attack, 20 men fall. Now, 20 men doesn't sound like a lot when you have thousands of soldiers. But imagine what's happening here from the perspective of the rest of the Philistines. They have lookouts posted. They can tell if the Israelites have launched an assault or not. They feel totally safe. And all of a sudden, men are falling and dying at the most secure and unexpected spot next to an invisible enemy, or due to an invisible enemy that showed up out of nowhere. This is like getting sucker punched by a ghost. And don't forget that the Philistines very likely have some memory of this God who can knock over statues, this God who can fight single-handedly, this God who fights for the Israelites. And so the Philistine force falls into a panic. It says here, in the camp, in the field, among all the people. What verse is that here? That's verse 15. It says the garrison and even the raiders trembled. So those raiding parties that had been sent out, they tremble. This is something that God is doing here. And it's more than just the Philistines trembling, as it goes on to say, the earth quaked, verse 15, and it became a very great panic. So just like the last time when God sent thunder, God is turning the earth itself against the Philistines. He's showing that the very ground that they stand on is not a safe place for their feet. And so things move. At the beginning of verse 15, it says a panic. At the end of verse 15, it says a great panic, or a panic from God. What we see here is this beautiful combination of a precision strike. There's the natural psychological shock of what's going on, and then God's direct involvement, and he throws the whole Philistine army into disarray. The next 5 verses tell us how the rest of Israel joins in what's going on here. But first, we get an almost funny but very sad account of what it took to get Saul in the game. Verse 16 shifts the scene back to Israel. So we're hopping across the canyon here. And you got to remember, they're both up high. They both can see everything that's happening. And verse 16 says that the watchmen of Saul in Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and behold, the multitude was dispersing here and there. So all of a sudden, there's this panic in the Philistine camp, and they're taking off. And what's Saul do? He immediately asks for a count of who might have caused this, and verse 17 says, behold, look, Jonathan and his armor-bearer were not there. And this sense of, this word look here could almost have the sense of like, oh, of course it would be them. Troublemakers are off again. Of course it's Jonathan and his armor-bearer. And so what does Saul do next? So just please remember here. Saul is the king of Israel, military commander, and his enemies are already taking off. His enemies are already in a panicked retreat. They are falling before the sword of his son, probably at that very moment. And what does Saul do? Well, he says to his sidekick, bring the ark of God here. Oh, they dragged the ark of God out of storage and brought it to the front lines, because that worked out so great the last time they did that, right? And the priest, he's wearing the ephod, we know, which means that he has the Urim and the Thummim, these lots that they would cast before the Lord to determine his will. So you see what Saul's doing here, right? He's saying, we need to ask God if we should get involved in this battle or not. He wants to know if they should join a battle that he should have started days ago, and a battle that God is already winning for them. Like, your enemies are already fleeing. This is like the guy that wants to pray about everything that God has already told us what to do. It's like, You should go to church. Well, I'll pray about it. You should stop cheating on your wife. I'll pray about it. And that's kind of funny, but sadly not in some cases. This is like the guy looking for water insurance after his house is already underwater. Like this just, like, come on, Saul, don't you see what's going on here? And it's funny, verse 19, now while Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult in the camp of the Philistines increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, withdraw your hand. In other words, okay, that's enough. Stop casting lots. Like, we don't need to do this. Saul gets the point. We don't need to ask God what to do. God is already working right in front of us. So verse 20, then Saul and all the people who were with him rallied and went into the battle. And behold, every Philistine's sword was against his fellow, and there was very great confusion. Remember how Israel didn't have swords? They didn't need them. The Philistines were going to use their swords on each other, just like the Midianites did in the day of Gideon. And there's a great confusion, the very thing God promised in Deuteronomy 7:23 to send on Israel's enemies. And the battle is joined. Verse 21 says that there were Hebrews with the Philistines, so these might have been slaves or mercenaries, we don't know, but they join in the battle. Verse 22 says all the people that were hiding, they come out and they join in the battle, and the Philistines are in full retreat. And verse 23 says, so the Lord saved Israel that day. The Lord saved Israel. Yahweh saved Israel. He used Jonathan. He used Jonathan's courage and skills and planning, but God did the saving. Now the battle continues, and Saul gets in there and basically wrecks it right away. And that's next week's passage from verse 24 on down, and Damien's going to be bringing the word to us next week. We pause here at verse 23 and we look back and we consider this very important relationship between Jonathan's actions and God's salvation. Because that's right at the heart of what's going on in this passage. And this connection between Jonathan's actions and God's salvation is a big part of the message that this passage has for us today. And while we could go a few different ways, I want to look at three overlapping areas where Jonathan sets an important and a good example for the people of God today. Three areas where we can learn from Jonathan, the faith of Jonathan. The first has to do with faith and action. Faith and action. Last week we saw how trusting God sometimes means waiting and doing nothing, when God has told you to wait and do nothing. That was the case with Saul. But this week we see that trusting God also, sometimes, perhaps often enough, means taking action. Samuel had already come. There was no more reason to wait. God promised victory to his obedient people, and Jonathan saw no reason to keep sitting around. So he did something. He took a godly risk. He didn't know the outcome. This is so important here. Jonathan did not know the outcome, but he knew the God who could control that outcome, who would control that outcome, and that was enough for him. And he took a godly risk. Do you think that many Christians could stand to learn this lesson? Including, often enough, in my experience, many Christian young people. And I could even maybe zero in a little bit more on young men, but let's just say young people. Young people, as you grow up, you will discover that making decisions is hard. Kids, you're going to find out that all of those times where it seemed like your mom and dad just knew what to do, that they totally didn't know what to do. And they were just doing their best. Making decisions is hard. Taking actions is hard. As adults, we have to make decisions all the time that we do not fully understand the outcome of. We say we're going to do this because it's right, and I don't know all the things that are going to happen. And much of the time, or many times I should say, young people are paralyzed by this. It's scary. And they can spiritualize their lack of activity by saying that they're just waiting on the Lord. Good Christians do this all the time. Some of you might be familiar with the story of Jim and Elizabeth Elliot. Jim Elliot was an incredibly godly, devoted young Christian man who kept Elizabeth Elliot on a string for years, refusing to marry her until he had a clear direction from the Lord. He didn't need a clear direction from the Lord. He had everything he needed in here. And as I read their story and Through the Gates of Splendor, Shadow of the Almighty, it seemed obvious to me that what Jim Elliot needed was an older man to kick him in the pants, perhaps literally, and tell him to go marry that girl before someone else did. Jonathan believed the promises of God, and he took action. Just like the apostles did in the book of Acts. Have you thought about that? Jesus said, go into all the world, start in Jerusalem, then Samaria, then Judea, then Samaria, then the ends of the earth. And then he left. Well, what are they supposed to do? They're supposed to make decisions and take risks and trust that God would redirect them if he chose to, as he often did, but not all the time. Whether we're young or old, we should not spiritualize fear by sitting on our hands and waiting for God to drop a message from the sky into our laps. Everything that we need to know about the will of God, he's already given to us. Everything we need to know. And so we trust and we obey and we do the next right thing. And we might not know how it's going to turn out, but we know who is writing the story. And we make ourselves available for God to work through us. And may the Lord do what seems good to him. Faith in action. That's a key area where we can learn a lot from Jonathan. Number 2, faith and thinking. Jonathan's example in this passage, and again, this is why you got to see the geography and everything, combines great faith with, as we've saw, great tactical strategy. And what this shows us is that trusting God and using our brain are not opposites. Trusting God and making a plan are not opposites. So just like we shouldn't spiritualize inactivity, we also should not spiritualize thoughtlessness. And this can sometimes be an opposite approach, right? So you have some people who are just paralyzed, and then I've met other people who have said, yeah, I'm going to go serve the Lord. Well, what's your plan? Well, who needs a plan? I'm just going to go serve the Lord. And that's not how it works much of the time. Trusting God does not mean jumping out of a plane without a parachute. Trusting God for Jesus did not mean jumping from the pinnacle of the temple, trusting that he would be caught up by the angels. It is not faithless to make plans. What James chapter 4 tells us in that famous passage is that it is faithless to trust our plans as if we were God, as if we were in control. We don't know what tomorrow will bring. But what does James say at the end of that passage in James 4? We should say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. You see, the plan is still there. I want to do this or that. And it's if the Lord wills. So faith is not opposed to using our brains and making plans. Faith knows that we don't trust those plans. And we factor God into those plans because we're not in control. And Jonathan sets a very good example of that. But once again, lest we get out of balance, number 3, Jonathan shows us the limits of human wisdom and human resources. Because yes, Jonathan made a plan. A really stupid plan if there was no God in heaven. Okay, that's what we got to see here. If there was no covenant God of Israel who had made promises to his people, this plan was a great way to get killed. So what if he kills 20 men in a surprise attack? If the rest of the camp rallies and turns against him. You see, like, this story could have easily ended with Jonathan's lifeless body being tossed off the cliff that he just climbed up. So we use our brains and we make plans, but do we factor the living God into those plans? Do we believe with Jonathan that our limited resources, whether that's financial resources or people resources, our limited resources are not a problem to God? Do we believe that the Lord can save by many or by few? I want to pause at this last point and carefully apply this to us as a church, as Emmanuel Baptist Church. I haven't been able to help but notice over the past few years, as we have made decisions about the kinds of things that we're going to do together, that the question of, can we do this, tends to rise to the surface quite a bit sooner than the question, should we do this? And perhaps this is not unique to us as a church at all. This might just be the way that people tend to think. But I want to give a very specific example, and I don't want to make us feel uncomfortable, but we got to see how this really gets down to the nitty-gritties. At one of our congregational meetings in the last couple of years, we were discussing weekly communion. And the elders had put forward some reasons to consider weekly communion. But in the discussion we had, we basically skipped right over that and all those reasons, and we started talking about whether we could do communion every week, whether we had the resources and the people to make it happen. Now, that impulse is not entirely wrong. Jesus commended the person who sat down to count the cost before they started a project, Luke chapter 14. So, not throwing any babies out with bathwater. But sometimes, don't you think we need a little bit more of the faith of Jonathan? That sometimes that we should start by asking, should we do this? And if the answer is yes, then instead of saying, can we do this, we say, how can we do this? How can we do this? How can we make this work? Because we've already established that we should, and we know who God is, so how can we do this? And we don't leave God out of that answer. We factor God into that answer of how can we do this, because we know that nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few. Now, once again, there's a bunch of qualifications that we could add to this. I know that some of us are more visionaries and we have a big idea and the details come secondary. I know that some of us are more practically minded and we think about the details and possibilities right away, and we need each other. God put me and my marriage together with a visionary and a very practical person, and we make a good pair. And as a church, we need different perspectives. But all I want to encourage us here is, as a church, as families, as husbands and wives, fathers and mothers in your families, as individual Christians, let's watch Jonathan this morning, and let's not play it safe. Let's not be like Saul, spiritualizing our inactivity because, well, I only have 600 men. Let's always be ready to say yes to something big that we can't do without God. This might be a really good test for you this morning. When's the last time you have said yes to something that you can't do if God does not come through for you? Let's think about that. Maybe that's a thing you need to take with you from this passage is, Lord, the next time that something comes up like that, would you give me the faith, even if I have to say no for other reasons, would you give me the faith to say yes to something that I won't be able to do if you don't keep your promises? Friends, that is such an exciting and a thrilling spot to be in, like Jonathan going down the canyon saying, here we go, and if God doesn't come through, I'm hooped, but I know who God is. One final way that we learn from Jonathan this morning, and actually has little or nothing to do with his example, it has to do with what he did and how Jonathan went out to do for Israel what everybody else had failed to do. Like David after him, Jonathan was the champion who took the fight to the enemy to save his people. And in this sense, Jonathan points us to our Savior, who did for us what we could not do. The events of 1 Samuel 14 paint a picture of what Jesus did on that dark Friday as he took the battle to the enemy, attacking the forces of darkness in a way that they least expected. Death on a cross. Putting them, as Colossians 3 says, to open shame. And brothers and sisters, the rout continues to this day. We're a part of it. We're like the people in verse 22 and 23 that have come crawling out of our holes, called from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of light, as we get to go proclaim the gospel and rescue people from the kingdom of darkness. And it's in the Great Commission that the work of Christ for us and the example of Jesus and Jonathan come together. Jesus has done what we can never do, would never have done, as he has died and risen again and ascended and promised to return. The enemy has been put to open shame. Only Jesus could do that. And now he has sent us out to make disciples of all nations. So maybe for you this week, one of the ways you apply this passage is by finally going and having that gospel conversation with that friend or neighbor that you've been too scared to do. And as you walk over to them or as you type the message, you might feel a little bit wobbly kneed, like Jonathan headed down to the bottom of the canyon. Maybe for you this week, it's filling out that application to that missions agency that you've been thinking about. Maybe it's just getting up in the morning and facing the day with faith instead of hiding in bed, which might feel like the easy thing to do. Whatever it is this week, would you take a step of faith? Would you put yourself in a spot where you need God? Because you know that nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few. And you look at the cross and you see what he's done, and you know that nothing can separate you from his love. God, please strengthen our faith. Help us to learn from this passage all that we need to learn. Thank you for Jonathan's example of wisdom and thought and planning and faith. Jesus, thank you for doing for us what we never could have done. And Jesus, as you have now routed the enemy, might we joyfully take our place in the chase. Help us, O Lord. Amen.